Hello everyone, welcome back to Multi-Level Mess. My name is Tori, and I am a goth against oppressive religions. Yeah, I know what you may be thinking. Tori, isn't this an anti-MLM channel? And you'd be right, talking about multi-level marketing companies is my primary focus for the blog and the channel, but I knew when I started it wasn't the only thing I wanted to talk about. I also have a fascination in religions and cults, especially after being raised in a religious environment and having to seek my own understanding of the world. I know that this topic isn't everyone's cup of tea, and I will probably piss off some people with my opinions, and that's okay. We don't have to agree on every little thing. If anyone doesn't want to hear me talk critically about something, I hope they'll feel free to skip that video or post. Just note that my critique, like with MLMs, will be focused on the organization in question, not individual attacks, and will be based on my personal knowledge and experiences. I have several people in my life who are religious or spiritual, and I don't love them any less for that, just as I would hope that they'd feel towards me for not being that. I'll leave comments open, but I'd like to ask my viewers to keep the discussion civil. An open conversation about these topics is encouraged as long as we can keep things respectful. Just a heads up, this video is likely going to be in multiple parts because there's so much to go through. I'll also be refraining from cracking jokes due to the sensitive nature of the material. Alright, now that I've probably scared off half of my subscribers, let's get into the video. I think of what could have been if I would have known what I know now. I would have never stepped foot in that church because it destroys people's lives. It destroys people's marriages. It destroys families. There are a few notable denominations in my town that I would label as a cult based on the analysis of many before me, as well as my own observations. Most tend to keep to themselves and generally aren't that intrusive. Sure, there's the occasional door-to-door visit, you know the ones, but for the most part these groups tend to be pretty quiet and respectful of the general public. I suppose one could make the argument that this makes those groups more dangerous as their oppressive ways are less notable, and that makes it easier to rope new members in. I have mixed feelings on the matter. I do feel that is a fair point, but at the same time I have respect for members of a religion who in turn would respect me. There is one church, however, that has chosen to stand out for all the wrong reasons. They're called the Potter's House. I live in a fairly conservative town, and yes, I do hate it, and I think it says something that even the most devoutly religious people here can take a look at the Potter's House and say, yep, that's a cult. As I go through everything, I'll try to remember to put up subtitles whenever I mention something that is in the BITE model. Just a reminder of what that is for anyone who doesn't know. The BITE model identifies specific methods that cults use to recruit and control members. Not every point on the model needs to be met for something to be a cult, and not everything that meets some of those points is necessarily a cult. It is a tool to critically analyze a group and spot warning signs. The four categories within the model are behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. I also probably won't cover every point on the model that applies to this group, since there was a lot of information to go through about all the controversies they've been involved in. Like, so much more than I expected when I decided to talk about it. I had no idea what rabbit hole I was falling into here, or the mental strain I would put on myself by researching them. Finally, I'd like to note that I am drawing from a lot of testimonies from former members that have been archived online throughout the years, but also from stories that I've been told in person. I know when it comes to anecdotal evidence, things should be taken with a grain of salt, but I think the patterns in these testimonies can help shed some light on what issues do and don't exist within this church. The Potter's House Christian Fellowship is a Pentecostal ministry. For anyone who's somewhat acquainted with cult studies, I'm sure the word Pentecostal set off alarm bells for you. And if that doesn't, then a brief look at their Wikipedia page probably does. Yeah, I know, Wikipedia is not the most reliable source, but it should be cause for concern when the page's table of contents has categories such as controlling behavior, shunning and mistreatment, cult, rape, and homophobia. Before we get into these topics, let's get into a bit more backstory. It started with people from the hippie generation and served as a center of acceptance. But for some former church members, it has been anything other than a positive experience. Information online about when the Potter's House began is conflicting. Some sources say it was in the 1970s, while others say the 1960s. From what I can gather, the founder, Wayman Mitchell, started his work while he belonged, and yes, that is the exact word that was used in the article I was reading, to the International Church of Foursquare Gospel. In the late 60s, he was appointed to be the minister of a Foursquare church in Prescott, Arizona, which was properly founded in 1970. Mitchell promoted a message of personal witnessing, which in a religious context means to profess a testimony about a religious figure or deity and proclaim it as truth. Personal witnessing usually means sharing one's testimony with others as a means to try to persuade them to rethink their beliefs and to join a particular faith. This message seemed to bring a lot of growth, according to Mitchell, especially from the youth in the hippie movement. With this growth, he'd establish more and more churches across the country and eventually the world. Following several complaints about him from other pastors at a Foursquare Executive Council meeting in 1983, Mitchell and his followers would sever their ties with the Foursquare Gospel and become an independent ministry. The Potter's House has several church locations worldwide, mostly in the US, but also seen in Canada, Europe, Eastern Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. Other names they go by are The Door, La Puerta, Victory Chapel, The Fire, Desert Fire, Bay Fire, and Lighthouse Christian Fellowship. Wow, that's a lot of fire. And by several, I mean that in 2020, they were reported to have over 2,600 locations worldwide. Jesus Christ! Mitchell was very active in church leadership and activities until early 2020, and he passed away September 21st, 2020. So now that we know a little bit about the origins of the church, let's get into the many problems of the Potter's House. Although I try not to blame the Potter's House for my leaving the church and God, I do know that my experiences at the Potter's House did affect how I view God. I always thought of him as someone who would only love me if I did the right thing 100% of the time. I felt that God would never heal me or speak to me because I was told I never had enough faith. As I've previously stated, the Potter's House is a Pentecostal ministry. Pentecostalism is a denomination of Christianity that places an emphasis on direct experiences with their God. There is a belief that being baptized in the Holy Spirit allows a Christian to live a spirit-filled and empowered life. At face value, this doesn't sound too out of the ordinary when it comes to Christian beliefs. The distinction here is that Pentecostals take that empowered part quite literally, as in they believe they can receive spiritual gifts through their God, spiritual powers, if you will. One of these notable gifts is the supposed ability to speak in tongues. Another one is faith healing, a practice that has been heavily scrutinized due to the overwhelming amount of scams using fake healings to influence audience, such as those by televangelists. Expanding on this, they also teach that participating in sin can result in physical harm or problems. For example, Wayman Mitchell believed that worshiping other idols could lead to eyesight problems, and that homosexuality causes deafness. And I'll be discussing the blatant homophobia within the church later, but instilling the fear of physical harm for sinning is very manipulative and a form of emotional control. As I mentioned before, there is a heavy emphasis on witnessing, and the group is well known for its street evangelicalism. Some of their methods for doing this have been met with disgust from the general public. For example, in my town, and reportedly many others, they would often dress someone up as a bloody Jesus and have them paraded around downtown while families were just trying to enjoy themselves. My dad has spoken to me about how when I was little, he used to have to cover my eyes at parades because they used to have floats with the bloody Jesus on there. Other parade displays in the past have featured depictions of Santa Claus tied to a cross and being whipped. They also have been known to just bombard pedestrians surrounding them and yelling at them, telling them they were going to hell. These practices have seemed to ease up in recent years, at least in my town, but that's likely due to the heavy amount of backlash they were getting. Another one of their ways of trying to draw in crowds for their sermons is their infamous haunted house they hold every year. Youth are drawn in by the promises of a free fright show, only to have the doors locked behind them and not being allowed to leave as they are subjected to very brutal imagery. And I'm not talking about your typical Fright Fest scenes. These ones were pretty fucked up, and I have a feeling YouTube might hate me for describing them. They have included things such as depictions of sexual assaults, including one scene that ended in a beheading, overly bloody abortions, a gay man who's died of AIDS and gone to hell for it, and even a recreated scene of the Columbine High School massacre. Yeah, I feel sick just talking about it. Afterwards, the guests would be ushered into a sermon about these horrors and how they could be saved from their sins. Needless to say, plenty of people who have attended these over the years have not been pleased. Imagine unwittingly thinking you were just going to a fun little haunted house on Halloween night, only to have a bunch of people screaming at you about abortion being murder and acting out one of the most horrific school shootings in US history just to try to get you to come to their church services. I understand that haunted houses tend to feature pretty graphic imagery, but in my opinion, there are certain lines you do not cross. Oh yeah, and reputable haunted houses don't lock people in and refuse to let them leave. That too. While the Potter's House seems to claim to hold an essential biblical doctrine, former members say that it isn't quite so. If you were saved at Potter's House, then you've only heard that doctrine and it's been drummed into you, says one former member. It is 90% Potter's House and maybe 10% Bible. That makes it palatable, like salt on a bad meal. Another former member who'd been there for 27 years said the fellowship churches didn't like questions about doctrinal issues. They don't want you to think for yourself. It seems like they believe that they speak for God, and very often the pastors end up preaching their agenda and personal opinions with little regard for the Bible. There is also a sense of elitism that seems to be preached by the pastors at the Potter's House. There are some good biblical truths that are taught at the door, but the biggest deception is to think that you are the place and that you are the best. For years, I witnessed them speak negatively from the pulpit about other ministries and how that there is no place like this place, so this must be the place. This seemed to me the height of spiritual pride, very destructive to the body of Christ at large, and it puts up fences, barriers, and divisions. Another former member from one of their chapels in Guam stated, "The next thing that bothered me was the church would openly attack any and all other church denominations, whether it was Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, Methodist, Assembly of God, or whatever. The pastor would stand behind the pulpit and rant about other churches for absolutely no reason. Apparently he wanted to convince people that every other church was wrong and that true salvation could only be found at the Christian fellowship churches, and of course at his in particular. He even went so far as to say that if you were saved there, that you would be out of God's will and backslidden if you left that church, even if you left Guam to attend another Christian fellowship church elsewhere. Some recollected the judgment they faced for being someone who didn't become a Christian through that particular church but joined it later. One of their leaders went so far as to label me a surrogate child because I didn't cut my teeth on their pews. For one thing, we were concerned about the attitude of many in the group towards outsiders. People from other churches were termed religious or lookies. Some even doubted folks in other churches were really saved. It irritated me somewhat that my previous service for the Lord was termed as being religious. This elitism has carried over into those haunted houses I spoke of earlier, as they were reported to sometimes depict other denominations that are also under scrutiny for being cult-like, such as Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, burning in hell. Leadership for these churches isn't chosen by the congregation, but through in-house training and discipleship, a process where men who wish to become ministers are mentored by their pastors before being sent out to start their own church. This is part of their emphasis on something called church planting, which I'll be talking about more later. I just found this notable because, as far as I'm aware, my parents have always been able to participate in important decisions for their church, such as electing new pastors or leadership, without being leaders themselves. Albeit they are part of a different denomination of Christianity, but it just goes to show another element of control in the Potter's house, where choice of authority isn't an option. Speaking of control, some apologists for the Christian fellowship churches say, for every bad or controlling pastor, there are thousands of good men around the world who are serving God. But this is not the case at the Potter's house, and the focus here is whether the Potter's house fits the general category of bad and controlling. Certainly, if a church is labeled controlling, which I believe is the case with the Potter's house, the next question should be, why have they been labeled by many people as controlling and or abusive? To determine whether or not a group may be a cult, we often take a look at how much control is maintained over the minds and lives of its members. Over the numerous accounts I have read through from former Potter's House members, there has been an overwhelming amount of talk about control. Perhaps it isn't as severe as some other cults I am aware of, but there is definitely enough there to be of major concern. The most common factor within these testimonies has been the pastors being excessively controlling and questioning them at all, leading to problems, which is a major point on the bite model under information control. On top of that, many elaborated that critical thought about teachings was heavily discouraged. I've never actually seen a pastor get angry or shout or say to someone, "You must do this." However, I totally agree that they are very controlling. If you're not at every church service, questions are asked. The logic is, where would you rather be than at church? At the Potter's house, I found that the pastor almost had a monopoly of power when it came to controlling the activities of the church and how its members should behave. It was almost as if he wanted us to be little replicas of himself and how he thought a Christian should behave. Men who entered discipleship to try to become leaders were often reduced to pastor pleasers, pressured into sacrificing most of their time and money for church-related activities, with some suffering from severe exhaustion as a result. Even members who weren't in discipleship faced the same pressure. One such instance was a man named Bruce, who, on top of working full-time and doing a full course load at college, became involved in all of his church's activities, outreaches, revival meetings, and regular church services. An excerpt from the book Churches That Abuse by Ronald Enroth says the following about Bruce's experience. After a few months of little sleep and failing, he landed in the hospital from sheer exhaustion. The attending physician told him to stop the whirlwind of activity or he would be dead in weeks. However, with his salvation at stake, Bruce continued, and as he puts it, sacrificed my higher critical thinking faculties to the leadership of the Potter's house. Week after week of meetings and revivals that lasted late into the night had done their job and caused him to just stop thinking. Another man who had been in the church for 10 years and was training to become a pastor remembered being shocked to hear his own pastor say that the kingdom of God is a spiritual dictatorship. He felt that he wasn't allowed to go against them, and that church members were pounded with a military-like regime, overwhelmed by psychological pressure. Some, who took a bit of time away from the church to spend time with their families, would often be berated for it later in a service. A former leader of one of their Australian churches wrote the following. After a tremendous 2-week holiday with my family on the northwest coast, I returned to Perth to discover that one of my pastor friends in Sydney had not only left the fellowship, but had also taken his whole church with him. The senior pastor pointedly preached a sermon dedicated to proclaiming that this pastor had basically lost his mind. The rest of the sermon I felt was aimed at me, partly because I had missed a few meetings whilst I was away. I got annoyed at this, to say the least, and left the building at the end of the sermon and telling my wife I was never returning. I never have. Another former member experienced something similar. One time, my wife and I went on a vacation, the first one in 3 years. It was great when we got back and shared with people how awesome it was and what a nice place it would be to raise kids. We were just dreaming. The next day, our pastor preached on running from God and talked about people moving away. And he specifically offered up examples like, you guessed it, the place that we had gone on vacation and dreamt about. If we moved, it would be out of the will of God. It was so embarrassing. There are numerous accounts of people not being allowed to own a television set or go to the movies, especially for anyone who wished to join the leadership. Some spoke about being forced to choose between giving up their TVs or losing their position, or for some, losing their home if they were trying to stay with other churchgoers. As one person recalled, the first thing I was told to do was get rid of my television. When I questioned this, I was told that the TV was possessed by satanic powers and that nothing was good about it. I didn't want to do this, but if I wanted to room with the other single men that attended the church, my only choice was to give my television away. They're discouraged from listening to certain types of music, like rock, including Christian rock, because we all know that the biggest threat to humanity's salvation is Skillet. Though some of the things their frontman has said lately have made me further question humanity's intelligence. Those who have left the church have said it felt like their God-given individuality had been stripped away. After attending many of the fellowship's revival meetings and conferences, it was obvious to me that not only did everyone think and speak alike, it was also considered wrong to think outside the walls of the Potter's house, not to mention visit other churches without being totally ridiculed by the other members of the fellowship. While some former leaders have tried to ignore the orders that their branches received about certain laws that needed to be followed, most ended up enforcing some strange regulations. For one, relationships are heavily regulated, from friendships to dating. They placed a lot of stress on the members by telling them everything outside the church is evil. You're not supposed to associate with your family if they are non-members. Unmarried people have to be in the church before they can even date, and then the people they can date and marry are just a select few. If you were a regular member of the church, it was your responsibility to get the pastor's okay if you wanted to date, and he would then say yes or no. If you went ahead without his approval, that would be considered rebellion. In a tape recording of a sermon, a pastor told his congregation, "When you guys come to me and ask me to get married and I tell you no, that's what God, the Father, is telling you." This carries on into marriage because wedding ceremonies aren't allowed to be private. Couples exchange their vows during a regular Sunday service in front of their congregation, and the bride isn't even allowed to walk down the aisle. Imagine, instead of having one of the most important days of your life be a ceremony of love shared with those you care about, it's treated as nothing special. And sure, there are people who choose to keep their weddings or elopements small without a bunch of flair. However, that, in my opinion, should be a choice, not something that is strictly forced. I really wish I could go over every single instance I found of former members speaking about how controlling the Potter's house is, but unfortunately I don't have time to fit it all in. Some other forms of control will be discussed in the next video, however. In the next part, I'll be going over the financial exploitation of its members, as well as some heavier topics such as the discrimination and abuse therein. Until then, thank you for watching, and please remember to check me out on Facebook and Twitter. My Instagram was wrongly disabled recently, which seems to be a widespread issue, but if it ever gets reinstated, I hope that you will follow that as well. Thank you to everyone who helped me reach my first 50 follows on the blog. I really appreciate it. If you want to follow too, please check it out at multilevelmess.wordpress.com. I hope to see you all back in the graveyard very soon.